Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the glow of gas lamps flickering against cobblestone streets. Hear the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the hum of factories, and the faint notes of music drifting from a grand ballroom nearby. This is the world of the Gilded Age, a time when America glittered with wealth on the surface, yet carried deep shadows beneath. Sit back, get comfortable, and let your mind wander as we drift slowly into this remarkable period of history. Before we begin, remember to like this video, subscribe to History to Relax, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more calming journeys into the past, crafted to help you rest, reflect, and gently fall asleep. Now, let's step softly into the first chapter of our story. Part 1. A City of Lights and Shadows. The Gilded Age began in the late 19th century, when America seemed to glow with prosperity. If you were standing on a busy street in New York City around 1880, the scene might appear almost dreamlike. Electric lamps were beginning to replace the flickering gaslights, and the streets themselves hummed with the new rhythms of industry. A horse-drawn carriage rattled past, its wheels clattering against the cobblestones, while the sound of a streetcar bell echoed faintly in the background. The city seemed alive, almost restless, as if it could never sit still. At first glance, everything sparkled. Shop windows glittered with imported silks and jewelry. Tall new buildings stretched skyward, their iron frames promising even greater heights in the years to come. Ladies in tailored gowns and feathered hats strolled along Broadway, their steps accompanied by the measured clicking of parasols against the pavement. Men in top hats and polished shoes hurried toward banks and offices, their pocket watches gleaming in the light. It was a world of elegance, wealth, and a sense of unstoppable progress. Yet, just a few streets away, a very different picture unfolded. The air was heavier, tinged with the smoke of coal and the sour smell of overcrowded tenements. Narrow staircases creaked under the weight of families pressed together in rooms no larger than a dining table. Children darted through the alleys barefoot, their faces streaked with soot, their laughter tinged with hunger. Mothers bent over washtubs, their hands raw from the cold water, while fathers worked in factories from dawn until well past dusk. In these cramped spaces, the brightness of the age seemed distant, almost cruel in its indifference. This was the paradox of the Gilded Age: glitter on the outside, shadows within. The phrase itself was coined by Mark Twain, who used gilded to describe something thinly covered in gold but hiding a base metal beneath. It was an age that promised beauty, but beneath the sheen were lives marked by hardship, corruption, and struggle. If you listened closely, the sounds of the city told this dual story. On one side, the graceful notes of a piano drifted from a mansion parlor, where chandeliers sparkled against ceilings painted with gold leaf. On the other, the rhythmic clanging of a factory hammer carried through the night, mixing with the shouts of workers demanding a few cents more for their endless labor. These two worlds coexisted almost side by side, separated not by distance but by wealth and opportunity. The streets themselves seemed to mark the divide. Fifth Avenue, with its grand homes of marble and limestone, stood as a symbol of triumph. Behind tall iron gates, families like the Vanderbilts and Astiers hosted glittering balls where champagne flowed like water and gowns shimmered with diamonds sewn into the fabric. For these families, life was a performance, a way to show the world that their power was secure, their wealth beyond imagination. Every gesture, every party, was a display of success. But if you stepped away from Fifth Avenue and walked toward the Lower East Side, the scenery transformed. Here, the buildings leaned close together, as though pressing in on the families within. Laundry lines stretched from window to window, forming a web of cloth that fluttered like banners of poverty. The smell of boiled cabbage and coal smoke lingered in the air, clinging to the brick walls. Men with weary faces sat on stoops, while children played with sticks and scraps of wood, creating games to distract from hunger. Despite the hardship, there was also a strange vitality here. These neighborhoods teemed with languages, traditions, and dreams carried by immigrants from every corner of the globe. Yiddish mingled with Italian in the air, and Polish songs echoed from open windows. Small shops sold bread still warm from the oven, while peddlers shouted the prices of fruit or second-hand clothes. It was noisy, crowded, and chaotic, yet filled with a kind of determination that wealthier districts never knew. The Gilded Age was not just about wealth and poverty, but also about invention. New machines were reshaping daily life, and cities pulsed with the energy of progress. Trains thundered across the country, linking farms, towns, and ports in ways that had once been impossible. Telegraph wires buzzed with messages, shrinking distances into mere minutes. And soon, electricity would bring light to every corner of the city, turning night into day and fueling the belief that the future had no limits. Still, progress came at a price. Factories demanded long hours under dangerous conditions, and children were often put to work as soon as they were strong enough to carry coal or sew buttons. Wages were low, hours were long, and safety was an afterthought. Fires broke out in sweatshop, and machinery often maimed those too weary to keep pace. The shadows of the Gilded Age were not just about poverty, but about the human cost of rapid growth. If you were to drift through the city at night, you would see this contrast clearly. A theater marquee lit up the sidewalk with dazzling bulbs, drawing crowds eager for a night of vaudeville acts. Just a block away, a line of men waited outside a soup kitchen, their coats patched and thin against the cold. The glow of the lamps did not reach them, and their shadows stretched long across the pavement. In one world, laughter and music. In the other, silence and hunger. The Gilded Age also reshaped how people thought about ambition. Wealthy families held themselves up as examples of success, proof that anyone could rise through hard work. But for most, opportunity was limited, and the gap between rich and poor grew wider with each passing year. Some began to question whether the glitter of the age was built on fairness or exploitation. Writers, reformers, and preachers started to call attention to the suffering hidden beneath the gold. Their words planted the seeds of change, though in the moment, progress was slow. To walk through a Gilded Age city was to witness extremes. A man might leave his cramped apartment before dawn, his lunch pail heavy with bread and onions, to work in a factory until the sun set. On his way home, he might pass a grand mansion glowing with light, where guests in velvet and silk waltzed to the sound of a live orchestra. These two experiences existed side by side, but they rarely touched. The essence of the Gilded Age lay in this tension. It was an age of confidence, of invention, of a nation that believed it was destined to lead the world. Yet it was also an age of hardship, inequality, and silent suffering. To truly understand it, one must see both sides, the glittering lights and the deep shadows they cast. As the century drew on, these contrasts would only grow sharper. The struggles of workers, the corruption of politicians, the rise of fortunes beyond imagination, all of these would define the era. But in this first glimpse, in the hum of the streets and the glow of the lamps, the Gilded Age revealed itself as both a promise and a warning. And so, as night settles over the city, one can imagine the lamps glowing softly in drawing rooms, while just beyond their reach, families huddle together against the cold. Two worlds, side by side, bound by the same city, yet living entirely different lives. This was the Gilded Age, bright, beautiful, and shadowed all at once. Part 2. Mansions of Marble. If the Gilded Age could be captured in stone, it would be found in the grand mansions that rose along New York's Fifth Avenue and on the rocky shores of Newport, Rhode Island. These were not simple houses. They were monuments to wealth, built to announce to the world that their owners had conquered industry, finance, or railroads. They stood like castles transplanted from Europe, but brighter, larger, and dripping with American ambition. Imagine walking along Fifth Avenue in the 1880s. On one side of the street, carriages lined up in neat rows, their drivers holding the reins of glossy horses dressed in polished leather harnesses. On the other side, towering facades of pale limestone and gleaming marble caught the sunlight, their columns reaching skyward as though to rival the temples of Rome. Each mansion seemed to compete with its neighbor, as if the very stones were locked in a contest of splendor. Inside, the opulence only grew. Step through the heavy brass doors, and the world transformed. A wide staircase, its railing carved with elaborate scrolls, rose before you like a stage set. Chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with frescoes of angels and clouds, their crystals scattering light into 1,000 glittering fragments. Plush carpets from Persia muffled every footstep, while gilded mirrors reflected the glow of dozens of lamps. It was as if wealth itself had been given a physical form, demanding admiration from every visitor. The drawing rooms were filled with velvet sofas, silk draperies, and statues imported from Italy. Pianos gleamed in corners, ready to accompany an evening of song or dance. In the dining rooms, long tables stretched beneath carved ceilings, set with fine china from France and silverware that shone like mirrors. Even the fireplaces were not spared. Some were made of rare marble, others lined with tiles painted in intricate patterns. Every detail, from the doorknobs to the wallpaper, spoke of extravagance. For the families who lived here, the Astiers, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, these mansions were more than homes. They were statements. To be invited into such a space was to be acknowledged as part of high society. To host a ball in such a room was to secure a place in the hierarchy of wealth and power. Social standing was measured not only in money, but in the ability to display it convincingly. And display it they did. The balls of the Gilded Age became legendary for their excess. Imagine a night when hundreds of guests arrived in carriages, the ladies' gowns glittering with jewels sewn directly into the fabric, the men's jackets cut from the finest fabrics. The air outside filled with the clatter of hooves and the murmur of expectation, while inside, music swelled from a live orchestra. Champagne flowed freely, poured into delicate crystal glasses. Platters of oysters, pheasants, and delicate pastries crowded the tables. Servants in crisp uniforms moved silently through the throngs, refilling glasses and carrying trays piled high with delicacies. The great halls rang with laughter, introductions, and whispered gossip. For a few hours, these gatherings created a world apart, one where wealth was absolute and hardship seemed like a distant rumor. But beneath the glittering surface, even these gatherings were bound by strict rules. The elite of the Gilded Age guarded their social circles fiercely. Mrs. Caroline Astier, known as the Mrs. Astier, maintained a social list that determined who was welcome at the grandest events. To be left off the list was to be invisible, no matter how much money one had earned. New fortunes, like those of the Vanderbilts, who had risen through railroads, often struggled for years to gain acceptance into this closed society. It was not enough to be wealthy. One had to prove refinement, pedigree, and the ability to uphold tradition. In Newport, the summer homes, though homes hardly seems adequate, carried the competition even further. Along the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, the wealthy built palaces with names like the Breakers, Marble House, and Rose Cliff. These were not cottages for seaside retreats. They were sprawling estates with dozens of rooms, designed for the brief summer season when New York's elite fled the city heat. On warm evenings, the sound of the ocean blended with the notes of music drifting from open windows. The lawns stretched like emerald carpets, dotted with marble fountains and carefully trimmed hedges. Inside, guests wandered through ballrooms lined with gold leaf, where ceilings soared higher than church naves. The sheer scale of these summer palaces spoke of a wealth so vast that even a few months by the sea demanded architecture worthy of royalty. The contrast with ordinary life was staggering. While servants poured champagne beneath chandeliers, families in New York's tenements crowded into single rooms with little light or fresh air. While guests waltzed across polished floors, factory workers labored late into the night, their hands blistered from endless repetition. The glitter of the mansions was undeniable, but it cast long shadows across the rest of society. For those who lived in the palaces, however, life moved in a rhythm of comfort and spectacle. Mornings might begin with leisurely breakfasts, served on porcelain plates by silent staff. Afternoons were filled with carriage rides, teas, or shopping in the finest department stores. Evenings brought the promise of music, theater, or another grand gathering. The days unfolded in elegance, every detail tended to by an army of butlers, maids, and cooks. Yet wealth also created its own anxieties. The pressure to maintain appearances was constant. Gowns had to be ordered from Paris, jewels displayed, homes redecorated to keep pace with neighbors. A fortune could vanish with a poor investment or a sudden scandal, and social standing was fragile. Behind the grandeur lay a quiet, relentless competition, not only to earn wealth, but to display it in a way that secured permanence. The architecture of the Gilded Age mansions still lingers as testimony to this pursuit. Walking through them today, one senses both the confidence and the insecurity that shaped them. They stand as monuments to ambition, to an age that believed wealth was destiny and that beauty could be built in stone. They remind us of a time when America dreamed in marble and gold, while millions outside those walls dreamed only of survival. And so, in these houses of grandeur, the essence of the Gilded Age shines brightest. They are the gilding itself, bright, dazzling, and meant to be admired. But as with all gilding, beneath the surface lies something else, the hidden cost, the unseen labor, the shadows that made the light possible. Part 3. Life in the Tenements. If the mansions of Fifth Avenue were the polished face of the Gilded Age, the tenements of New York were its hidden bones. Here, behind narrow streets and crooked alleys, families lived in rooms stacked one upon another, brick upon brick, until the walls themselves seemed to groan beneath the weight of so many lives. Walk with me for a moment down Hester Street, or Mulberry Bend, or Orchard Street, sometime in the 1890s. The sounds greet you before the sights do, the rattle of pushcarts rolling over uneven cobblestones, the cries of vendors shouting prices for cabbages, apples, or fish, the chatter of children weaving in and out of the crowds. The air smells of coal smoke mixed with pickled herring, fresh bread, and the sour odor of too many bodies crammed too close together. It is not unpleasant exactly, but heavy, pressing, thick. The buildings rise 5, 6, even 7 stories high, their brick walls already darkened by soot though they are hardly old. Narrow staircases climb within them, twisting upward past doors that are always opening and closing, as if the building itself cannot stop breathing. In these rooms, entire families often live in a single space no larger than a parlor in one of the marble mansions uptown. Step inside one of these rooms. The ceiling is low, the air stale. A small stove squats in the corner, fed by coal when it can be afforded, by scraps of wood when it cannot. A few mattresses lie on the floor, thin with use, patched again and again. Laundry hangs from ropes strung across the ceiling, dripping onto the boards below. A single window, grimy with soot, lets in a pale sliver of light, but more often it is shuttered against the chill or against the endless noise outside. Privacy is a luxury no one here can claim. In this space, families cook, eat, sleep, and work. Some sew buttons for piece wages. Others roll cigars, hammer shoes, or take in laundry. Children help as soon as they are able, their small fingers better suited for delicate stitching or sorting scraps. Every hour counts. The workday does not end when the factory whistle blows. It stretches into the night, candlelight flickering over bent backs and tired eyes. Water is scarce. Many tenements lack plumbing, so residents line up at public pumps in the street, filling buckets to carry back upstairs. The same staircases that groan with footsteps also carry the smell of waste, for outhouses in the yard often overflow and pipes break, sending foul odors through the air. Disease spreads quickly here: cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. A cough in one family can soon be a cough in many. And yet, despite the hardships, life in the tenements is not without energy. Step back outside, and the streets are alive with motion. Pushcarts jam the curbs, piled high with fruit, bread, or bolts of cloth. Mothers haggle over prices, voices sharp but familiar, while children run errands clutching coins tightly in their fists. Each block hums with a different language: Yiddish one street over, Italian the next, Polish and German close by. The city itself becomes a mosaic of old worlds pressed into the new. The immigrant experience lies at the heart of these neighborhoods. Families arrive with little more than a trunk and a few coins, carrying memories of villages left behind. They hope for better wages, for freedom, for the chance their children might have more than they did. Some find steady work in factories or on the docks. Others scrape by with day labor, never certain if tomorrow will bring pay. All must learn to navigate a city that is vast, confusing, and often unkind. Still, there is resilience here. Women gather in kitchens to share recipes and stories from their homelands. Men meet in corner saloons after long shifts, drinking cheap beer and speaking of politics or unions. Children play stickball in the streets, their laughter rising above the din of horses and wheels. Even in hardship, life insists on joy where it can be found. There are small triumphs, too. A family saves enough to buy a sewing machine, doubling their earnings. A boy earns a scholarship to school, his books worn but precious. A mother opens a tiny bakery on the corner, her loaves warm in the morning air. Each success, however modest, carries the weight of generations. But the shadows remain. Fires are frequent, for buildings are crowded and wooden staircases turn into chimneys when flames catch. When disaster comes, there is little escape. The narrow halls choke with smoke, and families cling to one another in desperation. Newspapers carry the stories, but soon the headlines fade, and the cycle continues. Reformers begin to take notice. Photographers like Jacob Riis enter these dark hallways with cameras and flash powder, capturing images of weary faces, narrow rooms, and bare walls. His book, How the Other Half Lives, shocks readers who have only known the glitter of the uptown avenues. Suddenly, the hidden world of the tenements is thrust into public view. Some are horrified, some defensive, but the truth can no longer be ignored. Children perhaps embody the paradox best. In the morning, they crowd into public schools, their hair combed neatly, their hands clutching slates. Teachers look out over rooms filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of eager faces, each child carrying the hope of a family sacrifice. In the afternoon, many return to work, folding boxes, selling newspapers, shining shoes. Their childhoods are shortened, yet their determination is fierce. On hot summer nights, families spill onto the fire escapes, seeking air that does not come easily within. The metal railings creak beneath the weight of parents and children alike, their bodies pressed together against the open night. From the street below, the tenements look like beehives, each window glowing faintly, each family visible in silhouette. Voices drift through the air, lullabies in unfamiliar tongues, arguments over money, laughter at small jokes. It is noisy, chaotic, alive. Life in the tenements is life lived close to neighbors, close to hardship, close to hope. It is a life of struggle, but also of persistence. For every story of loss, there is one of endurance. For every shadow, a faint glimmer of light. In these crowded streets, the true heart of the Gilded Age beats quietly. Not in marble mansions or glittering ballrooms, but in the kitchens where bread is stretched to feed too many mouths, in the alleyways where children invent games from scraps, in the weary eyes of parents who work until their bodies ache yet still rise again the next day. And so, the tenements remind us of the other half of the Gilded Age, the half not gilded but worn, not polished but enduring. They are the shadows behind the lights, the truth behind the glitter. And within them, despite every hardship, life continues, determined and unbroken. Part 4. Engines of Progress. The Gilded Age was not only an age of wealth and hardship, it was also an age of transformation. The air itself seemed to hum with invention, with new machines, new ideas, and new ways of living that promised to push the nation into the future. Factories grew taller, railroads stretched farther, and the steady rhythm of progress beat through city streets and quiet towns alike. If you close your eyes and imagine the soundscape of this era, it would not be silence but motion. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer had once been the pulse of industry, but by the 1880s, it was the roar of machinery that filled the air. Steam hissed, gears turned, pistons pounded in endless rhythm. The age of the hand tool gave way to the age of the factory floor. At the heart of this progress stood the railroads. They were not merely tracks of steel laid across the land. They were lifelines that bound a vast country together. Trains thundered across plains and mountains, carrying goods, people, and dreams. What once took weeks by wagon could now be crossed in days. Towns that had been isolated were suddenly linked to distant markets. Grain from Kansas, cattle from Texas, coal from Pennsylvania, all found their way to the bustling cities of the East or the expanding ports of the West. The railroads did more than move goods. They created time itself. Before their rise, every town kept its own local time, set by the sun. Noon in Chicago might not match noon in St. Louis, but trains demanded order, demanded schedules that spanned thousands of miles. And so, the system of time zones was born, slicing the continent into neat divisions that governed the arrival and departure of locomotives. For the first time, Americans everywhere began to live by the same clock. Factories, too, were transformed. The harnessing of steam, and soon electricity, brought new machines into every industry. Textile mills whirred with looms that spun cloth faster than any hand could weave. Steel mills blazed with furnaces so hot they seemed to mimic the sun itself, pouring out the beams and girders that would soon shape cities into vertical forms. Typewriters clattered in offices, while telegraphs clicked their messages across miles of wire. The pace of life accelerated, and the old rhythms of the village gave way to the new tempo of industrial modernity. Inventions seemed to arrive one after another, each more wondrous than the last. The telephone, first demonstrated by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, carried voices through wires as if by magic. Electricity, refined and championed by inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, promised to banish darkness with the flick of a switch. In cities where gas lamps had been dim and unreliable, electric light shone steady and bright, transforming streets into glowing corridors even at midnight. Consider what it must have felt like to see the first electric bulbs glowing in a shop window. The light was not a flicker but a steady, almost pure glow. Crowds gathered, staring in wonder at the strange brilliance. Children pressed their noses to the glass, while older men shook their heads in disbelief. It was more than an invention. It was a glimpse of the future, a promise that life itself could be reshaped by human hands. The world of communication shifted as well. Telegraph wires already crisscrossed the nation, carrying news from coast to coast in minutes. With the rise of the telephone, voices could now be transmitted as if distance itself had been conquered. Offices, newspapers, and homes buzzed with the possibilities. The age of isolation seemed to be fading. Cities reflected this progress in their very bones. Skyscrapers began to pierce the skyline, their steel frames rising higher than brick and stone had ever allowed. The first 10-story buildings seemed to scrape the heavens, and soon architects dared to dream even higher. Elevators, powered first by steam and then by electricity, made these heights practical, allowing ordinary people to rise above the streets with ease. To walk beneath these towers was to feel both awe and a hint of unease, as though human ambition might one day rival the mountains. Even entertainment was touched by innovation. Phonographs carried music into homes, their wax cylinders spinning out the voices of singers long after they had left the stage. Motion pictures, flickering and grainy, began to appear in Nickelodeons, offering brief glimpses of a world that moved across a screen. For the first time, people could hear voices and see images preserved in time, experiences once fleeting now captured and replayed. But progress was not equally shared. Factories may have been efficient, but they demanded endless labor. Machines could not run without workers to tend them, and those workers often endured long hours in dangerous conditions. The heat of a steel mill, the noise of a textile floor, the dust of a coal mine, these were the hidden costs of industrial progress. Inventions brought comfort to some, but they also magnified the divisions between those who could afford their wonders and those whose sweat powered them. Yet even in hardship, hope stirred. Workers dreamed that machines might one day ease their burdens, that progress could be harnessed for fairness as well as profit. Reformers imagined a future where education, public health, and technology might combine to lift all families, not only the fortunate few. The Gilded Age was not only about what was, but about what might be. Travel across the country revealed the scale of transformation. Towns sprang up along the rail lines, their streets lined with new hotels, depots, and factories. Farmers shipped their crops to cities they had never seen. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island boarded trains that carried them to the Midwest, the South, the Far West. The very shape of America was redrawn by rails and wires, by steel and electricity. At night, the evidence of progress was visible in the glow of electric light spreading through city streets. Lamps that once burned unevenly now shone steady, bright, and almost endless. Windows gleamed with this new brilliance. Factories worked long into the dark, and people began to live not by the cycle of the sun but by the steady, tireless glow of human invention. The engines of progress defined the Gilded Age. They promised speed, light, and connection. They made fortunes for those who controlled them, while demanding toil from those who served them. They transformed landscapes, redefined cities, and reshaped the way people thought about time, distance, and possibility. And so, as the century turned, America looked out upon a horizon filled with wires, rails, smoke, and steel. The engines of progress roared, unstoppable, carrying the nation into a new century with both promise and peril. Part 5. The Lords of Industry. The Gilded Age was shaped not only by machines and inventions but also by the men who controlled them. They were called captains of industry by some, robber barons by others. To their admirers, they were visionaries who built railroads, refineries, and steel mills that lifted the nation into modernity. To their critics, They were monopolists who crushed competition and profited from the sweat of the poor. Whatever name one chooses, these men stood as towering figures, their fortunes and ambitions unmatched. Step first into the world of Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate. Born in Scotland to a poor weaver, Carnegie came to America as a child, carrying little more than hope and determination. He began as a bobbin boy in a textile mill, earning pennies a day, then as a telegraph messenger, and eventually a railroad superintendent. His rise was steep, and by the time he turned to steel, he carried with him the discipline of hard labor and the shrewd eye of an organizer. In the mills of Pittsburgh, Carnegie forged his empire. He embraced the Bessemer process, a new method for producing steel cheaply and in massive quantities. The furnaces blazed, pouring out beams and rails that built bridges, railroads, and the skyscrapers that were beginning to transform American cities. For Carnegie, efficiency was everything. Costs had to be cut, machines improved, output increased. His mills roared day and night, their heat and noise spilling out into the city like a furnace that never cooled. Yet, for all his brilliance, Carnegie's methods were harsh. Workers endured long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. Strikes broke out, most famously at Homestead in 1892, where violence erupted and lives were lost. The episode revealed the deep conflict at the heart of the Gilded Age, the drive for progress and profit on one side, the demand for dignity and fairness on the other. Still, Carnegie became one of the richest men in the world, and in later years, he turned much of his fortune to philanthropy, building libraries, universities, and cultural institutions. He believed wealth carried responsibility, though many remembered the steel strikes more than the gifts. Across another industry, John D. Rockefeller rose to power through oil. In Cleveland, he founded Standard Oil, and through relentless strategy, he tightened his grip on the nation's petroleum. He built refineries that turned crude oil into kerosene, lighting lamps in homes across the country. But Rockefeller was not content with competition. He absorbed rivals, negotiated secret rebates with railroads, and created a trust that gave him control over nearly every drop of oil produced in America. By the 1880s, Standard Oil was a near monopoly, its reach so vast that it seemed untouchable. Rockefeller was quiet, methodical, and deeply religious, yet his business practices drew fierce criticism. Competitors accused him of ruthless tactics, and reformers pointed to Standard Oil as the very symbol of unchecked corporate power. Still, his fortune grew to heights no one had seen before. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller later devoted himself to philanthropy, funding universities, medical research, and public health campaigns. To many, he embodied both the promise and peril of concentrated wealth, a man who lit the nation's lamps while darkening the marketplace with his dominance. Railroads, too, had their titan. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known simply as the Commodore, had begun in steamboats before turning to rail. By the time of the Gilded Age, his family controlled vast stretches of track, linking cities and regions in a web of steel. Vanderbilt was blunt, forceful, and cared little for Polish. "What do I care about the law?" he once said. "Ain't I got the power?" To him, railroads were not only a business but a means of control. Schedules, fares, and freight rates bent to his will, and his fortune became one of the largest in the country. After his death, the Vanderbilt heirs continued to build palaces that displayed the family's wealth. Marble mansions in New York, seaside estates in Newport, symbols of triumph that glittered like crowns above the city. The Commodore himself might not have cared for velvet draperies or golden chandeliers, but his descendants embraced the display, turning wealth into architecture that could not be ignored. Then there was J.P. Morgan, the banker whose power was less visible but no less formidable. Morgan did not build factories or run mills. he controlled money itself. From his offices in New York, he financed railroads, reorganized industries, and stabilized markets in times of panic. When the U.S. Treasury faced a crisis in 1895, Morgan personally arranged the gold loan that saved the nation's credit. His presence in the financial world was so commanding that he seemed almost like a monarch, his word capable of moving markets, his gaze enough to unsettle rivals. Morgan's taste reflected his authority. His library in New York overflowed with rare manuscripts, medieval treasures, and priceless art. He collected with the same intensity he applied to finance, gathering beauty as if to balance the cold figures of ledgers. Critics accused him of wielding too much power, of placing private interests above public good. Yet to many, he was the stabilizer, the one who could calm storms when others faltered. Together, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Morgan embodied the spirit of the Gilded Age elite. Each had risen in different ways, from humble beginnings, from modest trades, or from inherited opportunity. But each came to dominate entire sectors of the economy. Their fortunes were staggering, their influence unmatched. They defined the very meaning of success in an age that worshipped wealth. But their stories also revealed the contradictions of the time. The same men who cut wages and crushed strikes also built universities, libraries, and hospitals. They gathered fortunes on the backs of workers who earned pennies, then gave millions to causes that promised a better future. They embodied ambition and innovation, but also greed and inequality. They were celebrated as symbols of American ingenuity, yet feared as monopolists who threatened democracy itself. In the marble mansions of Fifth Avenue, their families danced beneath chandeliers, while in the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the oil refineries of Cleveland, their workers sweated through endless shifts. The gap between the lives of the few and the many grew wider, even as the fortunes of the titans shaped the nation's destiny. The lords of industry left legacies that still echo. Skyscrapers stand on steel forged in Carnegie's mills. Foundations bear Rockefeller's name in medicine and education. Rail lines once traced Vanderbilt's vision across the continent. Morgan's influence lingers in the great banks that dominate finance. To walk through any American city today is to see their shadows still cast across the streets. And so, the Gilded Age was written not only in inventions and machines but also in the ambitions of these men. Their wealth was dazzling, their power immense, their influence lasting. They were the gilding and the shadow, the builders and the monopolists, the dreamers and the oppressors. They remind us that history is never simple, that progress often carries within it the seeds of conflict, and that greatness can be measured in both brilliance and cost. Part 6. The World of Work. Beneath the marble mansions and glowing lights of the Gilded Age lay another world, one less gilded but more essential. It was the world of the worker, of men, women, and children whose hands kept the machines running, whose sweat kept the furnaces blazing, and whose strength carried the weight of progress. The age may have belonged to the Carnegies, Rockefellers, and Vanderbilts, but its rhythm, its heartbeat, came from the countless laborers who toiled from dawn to dusk. Step into a factory floor in the 1880s, and the first thing that strikes you is the noise. The clatter of looms, the pounding of hammers, the hiss of steam. It fills every corner, pressing into your ears until it is all you can hear. The air is thick with dust, lint, or smoke, depending on the trade. Light filters weakly through high, dirty windows, while gas lamps flicker above. Rows of workers sit or stand at machines, their movements quick, practiced, and endlessly repeated. There is little conversation. The machines drown out most sound, and the pace leaves no room for pause. Hours stretch long. 12- and 14-hour days are common, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 if the orders demand it. Wages are low, barely enough to cover rent in a crowded tenement, food for hungry mouths, and coal for the stove. Many families need every member to work, fathers in factories, mothers at sewing tables, children wherever they can find pay. Childhood shortens here, replaced by labor that wears down small bodies before they are grown. In textile mills, young girls tend spindles that whirl at dizzying speed, their hands darting to catch threads that snap. In coal mines, boys crawl through narrow seams, dragging carts of black rock behind them, their faces smudged with soot before the sun rises. In glass factories, the heat roars like a furnace, and boys known as blowers' helpers run barefoot across hot floors, carrying molten globes from one station to another. Each trade has its dangers: spinning belts that catch clothing, furnaces that sear flesh, shafts that collapse without warning. Injuries are common, compensation rare. Yet despite the danger, there is little choice. Work means survival. Without wages, families face hunger, eviction, or worse. Employers know this, and many exploit it, replacing workers quickly if they demand higher pay or safer conditions. The laborer becomes as expendable as the coal shoveled into the furnace, necessary, but easily replaced. Still, there is pride in work, even in hardship. A steelworker may come home with his clothes scorched and his muscles aching, but he knows he has poured the beams that will hold a bridge or skyscraper. A weaver, though weary, takes satisfaction in the cloth that leaves her loom. Work shapes identity as much as it shapes survival. For many immigrants, a job is the first foothold in America, a place where dreams begin to take root, however fragile. Outside the factory, street life tells its own story. Newsboys, or newsies, crowd corners, their voices rising in chants as they sell papers for a penny each. Bootblacks crouch with brushes, shining shoes for men in polished coats. Women take in laundry, scrubbing and wringing until their hands are raw, or sew garments for piecework, paid by the item rather than the hour. Every street corner becomes an extension of labor, every moment measured in coins earned or lost. The conditions are harsh, but they breed resilience. Workers form friendships on the factory floor, share food during brief breaks, and help neighbors when illness strikes. Communities of laborers grow strong ties, bound not by wealth but by shared struggle. Churches, union halls, and saloons become gathering places where stories are told, grievances aired, and hopes shared. Children in particular reveal both the cruelty and necessity of this world. Too small for some machines, they are perfect for others, crawling under looms to fix threads, climbing into narrow spaces adults cannot reach. Their wages, though meager, often make the difference between rent paid and hunger endured. Reformers decry the practice, pointing to stunted growth, illness, and loss of education. Yet families defend it, saying without those pennies, survival is impossible. Childhood becomes another casualty of progress. Not all labor takes place in factories. Out in the fields, farmhands work from sunrise to sunset, planting, harvesting, and threshing with a rhythm as old as time. In mines, men descend into darkness for hours, their lamps casting weak halos against endless stone. On the railroads, gangs of workers lay track in blistering heat or freezing cold, their hammers striking iron spikes in steady rhythm. Labor is everywhere, in city and country, in light and dark, above ground and below. Women's work deserves special notice. Many balance both factory labor and the responsibilities of home, rising early to prepare food, working long hours at sewing machines, and returning to cook, clean, and care for children. Their pay is often lower than men's, regardless of effort. Some find work as domestic servants in the homes of the wealthy, scrubbing marble floors and polishing silver they will never own. Others labor in sweatshop, hunched over sewing tables in rooms where air barely circulates, producing endless garments for department stores uptown. Their hands stitch the very dresses worn at society balls, yet they themselves can scarcely afford bread. The world of work in the Gilded Age is not one of rest, but of endurance. It reveals the foundation upon which progress is built, the hidden labor that fuels the glow of electric lamps, the rise of steel towers, the movement of trains across the land. For every invention celebrated in newspapers, there are workers who endure the heat, the noise, the exhaustion that makes it possible. Yet seeds of change stir within this world. Laborists begin to speak of unions, of collective bargaining, of strikes that demand more than survival. Their voices are still fragile, often silenced by force or poverty, but they are rising. The discontent of the factory floor will soon echo across the nation, demanding recognition. The world of work is not only hardship, it is the beginning of a struggle for fairness, one that will shape the century to come. For now, though, the Gilded Age worker rises before dawn, shoulders his or her burden, and walks once more into the clamor of machines. The city wakes with them, its wealth and its shadows both fed by the labor of countless hands. And as the day begins, the world of work turns again, steady, unrelenting, and essential. Part 7. Strikes and Struggles. The world of work in the Gilded Age was not only long hours and weary hands. It was also a world where discontent grew quietly, like pressure inside a boiler, until it could no longer be contained. Factories and railroads, mills and mines, all demanded endless effort from the men, women, and children who kept them running. But wages remained low, hours stretched long, and the promise of progress seemed always to shine for someone else. Out of this tension came protest, and out of protest came strikes, moments when the hidden labor of the nation suddenly made itself visible by stopping altogether. The first great shock came in 1877, during the Great Railroad Strike. Wages had already been cut twice in 1 year, and when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced yet another reduction, workers could bear no more. They walked off the job in Martinsburg, West Virginia, seizing control of the rail yard and refusing to let trains pass. What began as a local protest spread like wildfire. Soon, workers across the railroads, in Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, and beyond, joined in, halting trains, blocking tracks, and raising their voices against injustice. For many, it was the first time the nation realized how much power workers held when they acted together. Trains carried coal, grain, passengers, and mail. When they stopped, the country itself seemed to hold its breath. Crowds gathered in the streets, some peaceful, others angry. In Pittsburgh, clashes broke out between strikers and militia. Train cars were set ablaze, flames lighting up the night sky as smoke billowed into the air. The strike lasted weeks, spreading across states, and though it was eventually crushed by federal troops, it left behind a memory that could not be erased. Workers, though poor, had strength in numbers. In the following decade, new unions began to form. The Knights of Labor sought to unite workers of all trades, calling for shorter hours, fairer wages, and safer conditions. They dreamed of a broad movement that included skilled and unskilled laborists, men and women alike. For a time, their vision grew, and their rallies attracted thousands. But with size came risk, and when protests turned violent, the public often turned against them. One of the most infamous moments came in Chicago in 1886, at a place known as Haymarket Square. Workers had gathered to demand the 8-hour workday, a dream that seemed simple enough, yet distant in reality. Crowds filled the square as speeches rang out. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a gathering not of violence but of solidarity. Yet as the evening wore on, police arrived to disperse the crowd. Suddenly, an unknown hand hurled a bomb into the ranks of officers. The explosion shattered the night, killing several and injuring many more. Gunfire followed, and chaos consumed the square. The Haymarket Affair, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves across the nation. For laborers, it was a moment of tragedy, where a peaceful demand had turned into bloodshed. For many in the public, it became a symbol of danger, linking unions with violence and anarchy. Leaders of the protest were arrested, some executed, though no one ever discovered who had thrown the bomb. In the end, the movement for the 8-hour day faltered, but the idea itself lived on, carried quietly in the hearts of workers. Strikes continued to ripple across industries. In the coal fields, miners laid down their tools, demanding not only better pay but safer conditions in shafts that too often collapsed. In textile mills, women walked out in protest, their needles set aside as they demanded recognition. Each strike was a gamble. Success could mean higher wages, but failure often meant blacklists, firings, or even violence at the hands of police and private guards. Perhaps the most dramatic struggle came in 1894, during the Pullman strike. The Pullman Company, famous for its elegant railroad cars, had built a model town outside Chicago for its workers. On the surface, it seemed a paradise: neat houses, tidy streets, a company-owned store. But beneath the facade lay strict rules and high rents, deducted from wages. When the company cut pay but refused to lower rents, workers found themselves trapped. They walked out, led by the American Railway Union under Eugene V. Debs. The strike spread quickly. Soon, rail traffic across much of the country was halted, mail cars blocked, and trains idle. The federal government intervened, sending troops to break the strike. Clashes erupted, rail cars burned, and lives were lost. Debs himself was arrested, and the union shattered. Yet even in defeat, the Pullman strike revealed the scale of worker frustration, showing that discontent was not confined to one factory or one city but stretched across the nation. Through these strikes and struggles, a pattern emerged. Workers demanded dignity, shorter hours, and fairer pay. Employers resisted fiercely, fearing any concession might encourage further demands. Governments, often aligned with business interests, sided against labor, sending troops or police to restore order. Violence flared again and again, reminding all that progress came at a cost not only of sweat but of blood. Yet even in the face of defeat, workers carried forward lessons. The 8-hour day, once dismissed as fantasy, slowly gained ground. Unions, though fractured, persisted, planting seeds that would grow stronger in the decades to come. The struggles of the Gilded Age laid the foundation for later reforms, labor laws, safety standards, and protections that future generations would take for granted. Still, in the moment, the strikes felt like storms. For the wealthy, they were threats to stability. For workers, they were acts of desperation. For the nation, they were reminders that beneath the glitter of marble mansions and glowing lamps lay tensions that could not be ignored. To walk through a Gilded Age city was to hear these struggles in the background. The clang of machines might be broken by the chant of strikers marching in the streets. A factory whistle could sound not the start of a shift, but the signal of a walkout. Posters on walls called for meetings, while rumors of violence spread quickly from mouth to mouth. The world of work was never quiet. It was restless, searching, demanding something more than endless toil. And so, the Gilded Age was not only an age of wealth and invention but an age of conflict. Progress was celebrated in newspapers and parades, but beneath it lay the struggles of those who built it. Strikes and protests revealed the fault lines of a society glittering on the surface yet divided within. The voices of labor may not always have triumphed, but they endured, carried forward in hope of a future where work would mean not only survival but respect. Part 8. The Political Machine. If the factories and railroads were the engines of the Gilded Age, then politics was the grease that kept those engines turning, sometimes smoothly, sometimes corruptly. In the crowded cities of America, where immigrants poured in by the millions and fortunes rose overnight, political machines grew powerful, weaving webs of influence that touched every corner of life. They were not simply governments in the traditional sense. They were networks of loyalty and favor, bosses and backers, promises and payoffs. To walk into New York City in the late 19th century was to step into the heart of this system. Here, Tammany Hall stood as both symbol and stronghold of political power. Officially, it was the headquarters of the Democratic Party in the city. In practice, it was a machine that controlled votes, contracts, and jobs with a grip so tight it seemed almost unbreakable. The machine thrived on the needs of the poor and the ambitions of the rich. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, confused and weary after their journey, often found members of the machine waiting. A helping hand was extended, a job on the docks, a bag of coal for the stove, food when hunger gnawed. In return, the machine expected loyalty at the ballot box. Each vote was another cog in the wheel, turning the machine stronger with every election. At the top sat the bosses. Perhaps the most infamous was William Boss Tweed, whose name became synonymous with corruption. Tweed was a large man, with broad shoulders and a face that seemed always to carry a smile, though his eyes hinted at calculation. He held no single great office, yet through influence, intimidation, and charm, he controlled the city. Judges, aldermen, police, contractors, all bent, in one way or another, to his will. Under Tweed, Tammany Hall became a fortress of graft. City contracts were awarded not for merit but for loyalty. Streets were paved, buildings erected, parks maintained, but always at inflated prices, with profits skimmed off for the machine. A courthouse built under Tweed's watch became a notorious example. Costs ballooned into millions, with charges for brooms, plaster, and chairs that could have furnished the city 10 times over. The building itself stood unfinished for years, a monument not to justice but to greed. Yet for all his corruption, Boss Tweed was not without defenders. In the immigrant wards of the city, many saw him as a friend. He provided coal in winter, food in times of want, and even money for funerals when tragedy struck. His machine turned politics into a form of social service, however corruptly it was delivered. For families who had little else, the machine's hand, however greedy, was also a hand that fed. This was the paradox of political machines. They exploited the poor, yet they also cared for them. They drained the public purse, yet they built the infrastructure that cities needed. They corrupted democracy, yet they gave new citizens a voice, however manipulated. Machines like Tammany Hall thrived in the tension between service and self-interest, generosity and theft. Beyond New York, other cities developed their own machines. In Chicago, Philadelphia, Kansas City, and countless smaller towns, bosses held sway, controlling police forces, distributing patronage, and shaping elections. The names differed, but the pattern remained. Loyalty was rewarded, opposition punished, and power maintained through a mix of favors and fear. The wealthy, too, found use in the machines. Businessmen seeking contracts or favorable regulations paid quietly into the system, knowing that grease on the right palms could smooth any obstacle. Railroads, breweries, builders, all dealt with the machine when it suited their interest. In return, the bosses grew richer, their pockets heavy with the coins of both rich and poor. But corruption never goes unnoticed forever. Cartoonists like Thomas Nast in Harper's Weekly turned Tweed into a figure of ridicule, sketching him as a bloated giant in striped trousers, his face instantly recognizable to readers. Reformers wrote articles, exposing inflated contracts and shady deals. Judges eventually turned against him, and Tweed's empire began to crumble. Arrested, tried, and imprisoned, he died disgraced, a shadow of the power he once wielded. Yet Tammany Hall survived, adapting, shifting, and continuing its influence long after its famous boss was gone. To ordinary citizens, the machine could feel both oppressive and protective. On election day, party men guided voters to the polls, ensuring ballots were cast the right way. Sometimes votes were bought outright, sometimes they were counted more than once. The line between civic duty and manipulation blurred until it was nearly invisible. For many, politics was not an abstract idea but a daily reality, tied directly to whether they had a job, heat, or food on the table. In the smoky backrooms of saloons and clubhouses, deals were struck. A contractor promised support in exchange for city work. A police chief pledged loyalty for promotion. A ward leader promised votes from his block, knowing he could deliver them through favors and pressure. Politics became less about ideas and more about exchange, a constant balancing of favors owed and favors granted. And yet, amid the corruption, machines did build. Streets were paved, schools erected, parks maintained. City services, however tainted by graft, did reach the people. For all their flaws, the machines managed to govern sprawling, chaotic cities at a time when official structures seemed overwhelmed. They kept order, of a sort, even if it was order maintained by bribes and backroom deals. The Gilded Age, then, was a time when politics mirrored the age itself, gilded on the outside, corroded within. Public speeches spoke of democracy, but behind the curtain, power flowed through channels of loyalty and corruption. Reformers struggled to shine light on the system, but the machine endured, adapting and surviving like the city itself. To imagine a city without the machine was nearly impossible in these years. It was in the streets, in the courts, in the police, in the schools. It was the invisible web binding together rich and poor, immigrant and native, business and politics. And though its presence often stained the ideals of democracy, it was also part of the reality of urban life. The political machine of the Gilded Age reminds us that power is rarely pure. It is tangled, compromised, flawed. It can serve and exploit at the same time. And in those crowded cities of the 19th century, it was the machine, not lofty ideals or polished speeches, that truly ruled the day. Part 9. Voices of Reform. The Gilded Age glittered with wealth and invention, but beneath its glow lay hardship, corruption, and inequality. Not everyone accepted this quietly. Across the nation, voices began to rise. Voices of reformers, journalists, preachers, and activists who believed the country could be better, fairer, and more humane. Their words and actions did not always succeed, and change was often slow. But without them, the shadows of the age might have grown even darker. One of the earliest and most striking voices came from the press. In 1890, a Danish-born journalist named Jacob Riis published How the Other Half Lives. Riis had walked through the crowded tenements of New York with a camera and flash powder, capturing the cramped rooms, weary faces, and barefoot children who lived in poverty just blocks from Fifth Avenue. His photographs shocked the public, revealing lives that wealthier citizens rarely saw. Dirty staircases, overcrowded beds, alleys teeming with ragged children. These images could not be ignored. Riis did not merely show misery, he demanded awareness, insisting that reform was both possible and necessary. Others carried reform into practice more directly. Jane Addams, moved by what she had seen in Europe, founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889. It was a settlement house, a place where immigrants could find help with education, childcare, language classes, and cultural programs. Hull House became a beacon of possibility, where reformers lived alongside the poor, sharing not only services but solidarity. Adams believed that society could not be divided into wealthy and poor, powerful and powerless. To her, progress meant shared lives, mutual support, and an acceptance of responsibility for neighbors. Hull House inspired similar institutions across the country. Settlement houses opened in cities from New York to San Francisco, each one offering libraries, nurseries, lectures, and training. They became centers of community and, just as importantly, training grounds for reformers who would go on to shape public policy. From these modest beginnings grew movements for sanitation, education, and social welfare that reached into the 20th century. Reform also came from the pulpit. The social gospel movement, led by ministers such as Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch, preached that Christianity was not only about personal salvation but about social justice. They argued that poverty and inequality were moral problems as much as economic ones. A true Christian society, they said, must feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, and care for the sick. Their sermons echoed in churches across the country, urging the faithful to look beyond wealth and success to the suffering in their midst. These words resonated deeply with many, particularly in immigrant congregations where hardship was plain. Churches became not only places of worship but hubs of community aid, offering meals, clothing, and guidance. The social gospel did not dismantle the machines of wealth and power, but it planted seeds of compassion that grew into future reforms, including labor rights and civil rights. Journalists, too, continued to wield their pens as weapons against injustice. Known later as muckrakers, they dug into the hidden corners of the age, exposing unsafe foods, dangerous workplaces, and corrupt politicians. Though the term would gain fame in the Progressive era, its roots lay in the Gilded Age, when reporters began to strip away the gilding and reveal the base metal beneath. Their stories brought public outrage and sometimes forced reluctant politicians to act. Women were among the strongest reform voices. The suffrage movement gained new energy during the Gilded Age, led by figures such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and later Carrie Chapman Catt. They argued that women's voices must be heard in politics if true reform was to come. Denied the vote, women nevertheless organized petitions, marches, and campaigns, pushing steadily against the wall of exclusion. Their persistence did not bring victory yet, but it built the foundation for the triumph that would come in the 20th century. Other women found reform in the realm of labor. Mother Jones, as Mary Harris Jones came to be known, rallied miners and textile workers, marching with children to protest child labor, demanding dignity for families whose lives were ground down in mills and mines. Her fiery speeches electrified crowds, her gray hair and grandmotherly presence giving her words both authority and warmth. She declared that workers had power if they stood together, and her message spread across coalfields and factory towns. Farmers, too, raised their voices. In the Midwest and South, they faced crushing debts, falling crop prices, and railroads that charged high rates to ship their produce. In response, they formed the Grange movement and later the Farmers' Alliances, demanding fairer treatment. Their protests gave rise to the Populist Party, which sought to challenge the dominance of industrialists and bankers. Though often dismissed by elites, their calls for reform, such as regulation of railroads and currency reform, would shape American politics in the years ahead. Reform was rarely easy, and often dangerous. Strikers were beaten, speakers mocked, journalists threatened. Politicians tied to business interests fought every effort to regulate housing, labor, or finance. Yet the voices did not fall silent. Each reformer added another strand to a growing chorus, one that declared the Gilded Age was not only about gold and marble but about responsibility and fairness. Even art and literature carried reformist tones. Writers such as Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty, questioned how wealth and misery could grow side by side. He argued for new ideas of taxation that would balance opportunity. Novelists like Edward Bellamy, in Looking Backward, imagined utopian futures where equality was possible, sparking readers to think beyond the limits of the present. Though fictional, such works stirred imaginations, urging society to see that things could change. To walk through a city in these years was to see the fruits of reform struggling to take root. A new public park offered fresh air to tenement children. A settlement house opened its doors, filling a room with the laughter of immigrants learning English. A church meal line stretched down the block, feeding the hungry with hot soup and bread. Each act was small compared to the vast needs, but each one mattered. The voices of reform could not erase the inequalities of the Gilded Age, but they did something just as important. They made them visible. They insisted that the glittering lights of mansions could not blind the public to the shadows beneath. They sowed the seeds of movements that would grow stronger in the progressive era, shaping the nation into one that, however imperfectly, sought to balance wealth with justice. And so, amid the noise of factories, the roar of trains, and the hum of electricity, the voices of reform rose steadily. They were often drowned out, often dismissed, yet they endured. Their message was simple, even if its achievement was not. A nation's greatness is measured not by its richest citizens, but by how it cares for its poorest. Part 10. The City at Play. Even in an age of long hours, smoky factories, and political corruption, people still sought moments of rest. The Gilded Age, for all its tension and hardship, was also alive with entertainment. Cities hummed not only with the clatter of work but with the laughter of theaters, the applause of crowds, and the quiet enjoyment of families strolling through parks. Leisure became part of the rhythm of urban life, offering brief reprieves from struggle and dazzling displays for those who could afford them. In New York, Chicago, and Boston, the theaters along busy avenues blazed with gaslight and, soon enough, with electric bulbs. Posters shouted the names of famous actors, comedians, and singers. Crowds pressed into lobbies heavy with perfume and cigar smoke, eager for a night away from the daily grind. Vaudeville became the heartbeat of popular entertainment, a mix of comedy, song, dance, juggling, animal acts, and short plays. The variety meant there was something for everyone, from immigrants learning English to wealthy patrons who came to be amused. Imagine sitting in a vaudeville hall. The lights dim, and the stage curtain rises. A comic bursts forth, spinning jokes that draw laughter from the crowd. He is followed by a troupe of dancers in glittering costumes, their movements quick and precise. Then a singer takes the stage, her voice filling the room with a ballad that silences even the most restless in the audience. Between acts, the crowd murmurs, children whisper, and vendors weave through the aisles with peanuts and sweets. The show moves briskly, a patchwork of acts stitched together into one long, lively evening. For the wealthy, evenings might also mean opera houses, where chandeliers glittered and velvet seats embraced their audiences. There, the voices of European divas filled the air, soaring above orchestras that seemed to carry listeners far away from the noisy streets outside. The opera was not only music, it was society. To be seen in the boxes was to confirm one's place among the elite, each gown and jewel another display of status. Applause was as much for the performance as for the spectacle of the audience itself. For ordinary families, leisure was simpler but no less cherished. Parks became essential havens in crowded cities. Central Park in New York, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, stretched like a green oasis amid brick and stone. On weekends, families strolled along its winding paths, children raced across lawns, and couples rowed boats across quiet ponds. In the summer, bands played concerts on the grass, filling the air with marches and waltzes that carried on the breeze. For tenement dwellers, the park offered a taste of fresh air, a moment of escape from the cramped rooms they called home. Street life itself often provided entertainment. Organ grinders turned handles on corners, filling the air with jaunty tunes as monkeys in small vests collected coins. Peddlers drew attention with loud calls, selling everything from roasted chestnuts to penny toys. Newsboys shouted headlines, their voices competing with the clatter of horses and carriages. The streets were stages in their own way, alive with noise, motion, and endless novelty. Sports, too, began to capture the public imagination. Baseball, already called America's pastime, drew crowds to ballparks where cheers and groans rose with each crack of the bat. Teams like the New York Giants, the Boston Beaneaters, and the Chicago White Stockings filled stadiums with fans eager for the thrill of competition. The game was fast, simple, and democratic, a sport that welcomed both factory workers and businessmen into the same stands. Boxing also surged in popularity, though it carried a rougher edge. Matches were often held in smoky halls, with betting fierce and tempers high. Champions like John L. Sullivan became household names, their bouts covered breathlessly in newspapers. To many, the fight symbolized grit, endurance, and the raw strength admired in a nation building itself through labor. For children, play was often improvised. Streets became playgrounds where stickball, marbles, and hopscotch filled the hours between school and work. A rag ball might serve as a baseball, a piece of chalk as a boundary line. Imagination turned alleys into worlds of adventure. Even in poverty, laughter echoed between the brick walls, proof that joy could bloom in even the harshest soil. The rise of new amusements added to the excitement. Coney Island, on the edge of Brooklyn, became a wonderland of rides, sideshows, and seaside escapes. Crowds packed trains and ferries to reach its boardwalks, where roller coasters rattled, Ferris wheels turned, and the scent of fried food filled the salty air. For a dime or a quarter, visitors could forget the grime of the city and taste a world of spectacle and delight. Coney Island's electric lights glittered against the night sky, its attractions glowing like promises of a brighter age. Even the invention of moving pictures brought new wonder. Though still crude, flickering, silent, and brief, they drew eager audiences. A train rushing toward the screen could make viewers gasp and clutch their seats. A dancer, twirling endlessly in a captured loop, seemed like magic brought to life. These early films hinted at a new form of leisure that would soon dominate the 20th century. Music halls, beer gardens, and dance halls filled the gaps. Immigrant neighborhoods often built their own spaces for leisure, where traditional songs were played, and folk dances filled the evenings. German beer gardens rang with laughter and song. Italian festivals spilled into the streets, with banners, music, and food. Each community carried its old-world traditions into the new, creating a patchwork of entertainment that gave American cities their unique character. Of course, leisure was also divided by class. The elite danced in glittering ballrooms beneath chandeliers, while the poor found amusement in dime museums, penny arcades, or the simple act of walking the streets with friends. But all sought the same thing: moments of release, of laughter, of wonder that lifted them beyond daily burdens. To stroll through a Gilded Age city at night was to feel its dual energy. On one block, a vaudeville theater spilled light and laughter into the street. On the next, a darkened tenement stood quiet, its families already asleep before another long day of labor. But even in the shadows, there was leisure, a lullaby sung to a child, a story told by lamplight, a neighbor's laugh drifting through thin walls. Leisure did not erase hardship, but it softened it. It gave people memories to carry, songs to hum at work, stories to tell children. It reminded the nation that even in times of inequality and corruption, there was space for joy. And in the glow of amusement halls, the green of city parks, the roar of baseball crowds, and the laughter of vaudeville, the Gilded Age revealed another side of itself, not only the struggle to survive, but the desire to live fully. Part 11. The Written Word. In the Gilded Age, cities roared with machines and theatres, but another sound echoed just as powerfully: the rustle of paper. Newspapers, pamphlets, dime novels, and magazines poured from presses at astonishing speed, spreading ideas, stories, and scandals into every corner of the nation. To walk through a city street was to see newsboys waving stacks of fresh pages, shouting headlines that promised triumph, tragedy, or outrage. The written word became both mirror and engine of the age, reflecting its brilliance and its corruption, shaping what people knew and what they believed. By the 1880s and 1890s, the daily newspaper had become a fixture of American life. In New York alone, dozens of papers competed for readers, each vying to outdo the others in drama, detail, or daring. The New York Times, sober and serious, carried reports for businessmen and professionals. The New York World, under Joseph Pulitzer, reached the working class with bold headlines, cartoons, and investigative stories. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal chased sensationalism with zeal, filling its pages with scandals, crimes, and lurid tales that demanded attention. These papers sold for just a penny, making them accessible even to the poor. For the price of a loaf of bread, a reader could buy a glimpse of the wider world, of politics in Washington, wars abroad, strikes in Chicago, or murders in their own neighborhoods. News became both entertainment and necessity, a way to connect millions of citizens to the pulse of the nation. The rise of yellow journalism, as it came to be known, added a new flavor. Sensational headlines shouted in bold type, "Murder in the Tenements," "Scandal in the Senate," "Disaster on the Rails." Photographs and drawings dramatized events, while stories blurred the line between fact and embellishment. Pulitzer and Hearst competed fiercely, each pushing their papers to extremes of style and content. For readers, the effect was irresistible. Each morning, the world seemed larger, more thrilling, more dangerous, and always just a page away. Cartoons, too, shaped public opinion. Artists like Thomas Nast used ink and imagination to skewer politicians, businessmen, and corruption. His drawings of Boss Tweed, bloated and menacing, fixed the politician's image in the public mind far more effectively than words alone could. Nast's Santa Claus, cheerful and jolly, gave lasting form to a figure still beloved today. In every issue of Harper's Weekly, the power of the pen, or rather the pencil, revealed itself, proving that art and text together could sway the masses. But not all printed words carried scandal or satire. The Gilded Age was also the golden age of the dime novel. Cheap, portable stories that thrilled readers with tales of cowboys, detectives, and daring adventurers. Sold for just a few cents, these little books spread quickly through working-class neighborhoods, offering escape from long hours and crowded rooms. Children devoured them, imagining themselves as outlaws on the frontier or sleuths in smoky city alleys. For many immigrants, dime novels became one of the first American traditions they adopted, the stories teaching not only English words but American dreams of courage and independence. Some writers sought more than entertainment. Mark Twain, with novels like The Gilded Age and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, used humor and satire to expose the contradictions of society, its pretensions, its hypocrisies, its injustices. Twain's wit cut deep, but his storytelling carried readers along gently, allowing them to laugh even as they reflected. His words reminded the nation that beneath the gold leaf, the base metal of greed and folly remained. Others, like Henry James, explored the subtleties of class, manners, and morality in novels that contrasted American energy with European tradition. Edith Wharton would later do the same, chronicling the lives of the wealthy with both elegance and critique. Writers became not just entertainers but interpreters, guiding readers through the complexities of a changing society. Magazines flourished as well. The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Magazine, and Scribner's offered essays, fiction, and poetry for readers who craved more than headlines. They introduced new literary voices, debated politics and culture, and connected a growing middle class to the wider world of ideas. For many families, the arrival of a monthly issue was an event. The glossy pages read aloud in parlors or carried on trains. The written word also fueled reform. Pamphlets exposed corruption, novels stirred sympathy for the poor, and investigative articles laid bare the abuses of factories and tenements. When Jacob Riis combined photographs with text in How the Other Half Lives, the effect was immediate. Readers could not only read about suffering, they could see it. Words alone had power, but words joined with images could rattle even the most comfortable conscience. Education expanded access to print. Public schools spread across cities and towns, teaching millions of children to read. Libraries, many funded by Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy, opened their doors, offering shelves of books to anyone willing to step inside. In dusty rooms filled with the smell of ink and leather, children discovered worlds beyond their neighborhoods, while adults found guidance, knowledge, and sometimes hope. The power of the written word was not always benign. Sensational stories could inflame prejudice, stir fear, or spread misinformation. Strikes and protests were often depicted as dangerous, their leaders as radicals or anarchists. Immigrants were caricatured in cartoons that reinforced stereotypes. Newspapers, eager for sales, sometimes stoked division rather than understanding. The pen, like the machine, could build or destroy, depending on whose hand held it. Still, for the people of the Gilded Age, print was a constant companion. A newsboy's cry in the morning meant the world was ready to be read. A dime novel tucked into a pocket-offered adventure on the streetcar ride home. A magazine on the parlor table gave families something to share by lamplight. The rustle of pages became as familiar as the ring of a factory bell or the whistle of a train. In this age of steel and smoke, the written word provided both escape and connection. It carried laughter, outrage, inspiration, and knowledge. It gave power to reformers and comfort to dreamers. And in the voices of Twain, Riis, Wharton, Pulitzer, Hearst, and countless others, the Gilded Age found not only its story but its soul. 11. The written word. In the Gilded Age, cities roared with machines and theaters, but another sound echoed just as powerfully, the rustle of paper. Newspapers, pamphlets, dime novels, and magazines poured from presses at astonishing speed, spreading ideas, stories, and scandals into every corner of the nation. To walk through a city street was to see newsboys waving stacks of fresh pages, shouting headlines that promised triumph, tragedy, or outrage. The written word became both mirror and engine of the age, reflecting its brilliance and its corruption, shaping what people knew and what they believed. By the 1880s and 1890s, the daily newspaper had become a fixture of American life. In New York alone, dozens of papers competed for readers, each vying to outdo the others in drama, detail, or daring. The New York Times, sober and serious, carried reports for businessmen and professionals. The New York World, under Joseph Pulitzer, reached the working class with bold headlines, cartoons, and investigative stories. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal chased sensationalism with zeal, filling its pages with scandals, crimes, and lurid tales that demanded attention. These papers sold for just a penny, making them accessible even to the poor. For the price of a loaf of bread, a reader could buy a glimpse of the wider world, of politics in Washington, wars abroad, strikes in Chicago, or murders in their own neighborhoods. News became both entertainment and necessity, a way to connect millions of citizens to the pulse of the nation. The rise of yellow journalism, as it came to be known, added a new flavor. Sensational headlines shouted in bold type, "Murder in the Tenements," "Scandal in the Senate," "Disaster on the Rails." Photographs and drawings dramatized events, while stories blurred the line between fact and embellishment. Pulitzer and Hearst competed fiercely, each pushing their papers to extremes of style and content. For readers, the effect was irresistible. Each morning, the world seemed larger, more thrilling, more dangerous, and always just a page away. Cartoons, too, shaped public opinion. Artists like Thomas Nast used ink and imagination to skewer politicians, businessmen, and corruption. His drawings of Boss Tweed, bloated and menacing, fixed the politician's image in the public mind far more effectively than words alone could. Nast's Santa Claus, cheerful and jolly, gave lasting form to a figure still beloved today. In every issue of Harper's Weekly, the power of the pen, or rather the pencil, revealed itself, proving that art and text together could sway the masses. But not all printed words carried scandal or satire. The Gilded Age was also the golden age of the dime novel. Cheap, portable stories that thrilled readers with tales of cowboys, detectives, and daring adventurers. Sold for just a few cents, these little books spread quickly through working-class neighborhoods, offering escape from long hours and crowded rooms. Children devoured them, imagining themselves as outlaws on the frontier or sleuths in smoky city alleys. For many immigrants, dime novels became one of the first American traditions they adopted, the stories teaching not only English words but American dreams of courage and independence. Some writers sought more than entertainment. Mark Twain, with novels like The Gilded Age and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, used humor and satire to expose the contradictions of society, its pretensions, its hypocrisies, its injustices. Twain's wit cut deep, but his storytelling carried readers along gently, allowing them to laugh even as they reflected. His words reminded the nation that beneath the gold leaf, the base metal of greed and folly remained. Others, like Henry James, explored the subtleties of class, manners, and morality in novels that contrasted American energy with European tradition. Edith Wharton would later do the same, chronicling the lives of the wealthy with both elegance and critique. Writers became not just entertainers but interpreters, guiding readers through the complexities of a changing society. Magazines flourished as well. The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Magazine, and Scribner's offered essays, fiction, and poetry for readers who craved more than headlines. They introduced new literary voices, debated politics and culture, and connected a growing middle class to the wider world of ideas. For many families, the arrival of a monthly issue was an event, the glossy pages read aloud in parlors or carried on trains. The written word also fueled reform. Pamphlets exposed corruption, novels stirred sympathy for the poor, and investigative articles laid bare the abuses of factories and tenements. When Jacob Riis combined photographs with text in How the Other Half Lives, the effect was immediate. Readers could not only read about suffering, they could see it. Words alone had power, but words joined with images could rattle even the most comfortable conscience. Education expanded access to print. Public schools spread across cities and towns, teaching millions of children to read. Libraries, many funded by Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy, opened their doors, offering shelves of books to anyone willing to step inside. In dusty rooms filled with the smell of ink and leather, children discovered worlds beyond their neighborhoods, while adults found guidance, knowledge, and sometimes hope. The power of the written word was not always benign. Sensational stories could inflame prejudice, stir fear, or spread misinformation. Strikes and protests were often depicted as dangerous, their leaders as radicals or anarchists. Immigrants were caricatured in cartoons that reinforced stereotypes. Newspapers, eager for sales, sometimes stoked division rather than understanding. The pen, like the machine, could build or destroy, depending on whose hand held it. Still, for the people of the Gilded Age, print was a constant companion. A newsboy's cry in the morning meant the world was ready to be read. A dime novel tucked into a pocket offered adventure on the streetcar ride home. A magazine on the parlor table gave families something to share by lamplight. The rustle of pages became as familiar as the ring of a factory bell or the whistle of a train. In this age of steel and smoke, the written word provided both escape and connection. It carried laughter, outrage, inspiration, and knowledge. It gave power to reformers and comfort to dreamers. And in the voices of Twain, Rees, Wharton, Pulitzer, Hearst, and countless others, the Gilded Age found not only its story but its soul. Part 12. The Immigrant's Journey. The story of the Gilded Age cannot be told without the story of the immigrant. Between 1870 and 1900, more than 12 million people arrived in the United States, their ships docking at ports from Boston to Galveston, but most of all at New York Harbor. Each arrival carried hope, anxiety, and the weight of leaving an old world behind. For many, the first glimpse of America came in the form of the Statue of Liberty, her torch lifted high above the water. To some, she seemed a promise. To others, a question. Would the land ahead truly offer freedom, or merely another kind of struggle? The journey itself was often difficult. Immigrants traveled in steerage, the lowest level of the ship, where air was stale, food was sparse, and privacy non-existent. Families slept in rows of bunks, seasick children clung to their mothers, and the sound of coughing carried through the dark. Yet even in these conditions, laughter sometimes broke out. Songs were sung in many tongues. Friendships formed among strangers bound for the same uncertain future. Above them, wealthier passengers enjoyed cabins and promenades. But in steerage, survival was measured in small comforts. A kind word, a shared loaf, the first sight of seagulls signaling land ahead. At last, the ship entered New York Harbor. Passengers crowded the deck, straining to see the skyline, the islands, the figure of liberty rising from her pedestal. Some wept openly, others crossed themselves, others stood in silence. Whatever their thoughts, the moment carried weight, a doorway into a new life, framed by the sea. From the harbor, boats ferried them to Ellis Island, the gateway for millions. The great halls echoed with footsteps and voices, interpreters calling out in dozens of languages. Families clutched their bundles, children wide-eyed, as inspectors examined eyes for disease, asked questions about names, ages, and destinations. For most, the process was quick, though intimidating. A chalk mark on a coat might mean a medical check. A confusing question might mean delay. Some were turned back, sent home if illness or poverty seemed too great. But most were allowed through, their names recorded, their futures open to the vast unknown of America. Stepping into the city was like entering another world. Streets thrummed with motion, horse-drawn carts, electric streetcars, shouting vendors, the clang of machinery from factories nearby. For newcomers, it could feel overwhelming, a storm of sound and smell. Yet amid the chaos, communities quickly formed. Italians clustered in Little Italy, Jews in the Lower East Side, Chinese in Chinatown, Germans in Yorkville, Irish in Hell's Kitchen. Each group brought its language, food, and traditions, carving small homelands within the vastness of the city. Life was not easy. Tenements swallowed families whole, cramming them into dark, narrow rooms. Work was hard to find, and when found, it was often dangerous and poorly paid. Immigrants took jobs in factories, on railroads, in sweatshop, or as day laborers on the docks. Women sewed shirts for pennies, men hauled bricks or shoveled coal, children sold newspapers or rolled cigars. The dream of America was real, but it was often bought with exhaustion. Still, hope persisted. Small shops opened on crowded streets, offering bread still warm from the oven, sausages spiced with old-world recipes, pickles brined in barrels by the door. Street festivals brought music, banners, and color, filling neighborhoods with life. Churches and synagogues rose, their bells and prayers anchoring new lives in faith and community. Schools, though crowded, welcomed children, giving them words and numbers that linked them to their new country. Each success, however modest, felt like a triumph. For many immigrants, the first generation bore the heaviest burden. They worked long hours, often speaking little English, saving every coin. The second generation, their children, carried forward the promise, attending schools, entering professions, and weaving themselves more fully into the fabric of American life. This cycle, though uneven, gave shape to countless family stories. Sacrifice followed by opportunity, hardship followed by hope. But prejudice was never far away. Signs appeared in shop windows, "No Irish need apply." Riots flared against Chinese workers in the West, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major law to bar immigration by nationality. Italians, Jews, Poles, and others faced suspicion and hostility, accused of taking jobs, lowering wages, or refusing to assimilate. Cartoons mocked their accents, clothes, or customs. The promise of America was real, but it was often shadowed by rejection. Yet resilience defined the immigrant story. Families endured slurs and setbacks, but they persisted. They built unions, newspapers, mutual aid societies. They celebrated their holidays with parades, music, and food that turned unfamiliar streets into familiar homes. Children translated for parents, bridging old worlds and new. Slowly, often painfully, the immigrant became not stranger but neighbor, not outsider but citizen. Beyond the cities, many immigrants pushed westward. Germans and Scandinavians farmed the plains, bringing with them new techniques and traditions. Italians and Slavs worked in mines, digging coal that fueled factories and railroads. Chinese laborers, already vital to the building of the transcontinental railroad, settled in the West, opening shops and laundries, surviving against both hardship and hostility. Each community left its mark, shaping the culture, economy, and identity of the nation. The immigrant's journey was not only physical but emotional. Letters carried news across oceans, written in careful script, folded and refolded until the paper wore thin. They told of struggles and small victories, of children growing quickly, of the ache of homesickness that never fully faded. In villages in Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Russia, families gathered around these letters, weighing whether they too should risk the journey. The dream of America traveled not only in ships but in words, binding continents with hope. In the end, the immigrant's journey became the nation's story. The Gilded Age may be remembered for its tycoons, its machines, and its corruption, but it was also built by the millions who arrived with nothing but determination. They laid tracks, stitched garments, baked bread, dug coal, and filled classrooms. They endured hardship and prejudice, yet through their persistence, they reshaped the nation into something larger, more diverse, and more resilient. To stand in the Great Hall of Ellis Island today, with its arched ceilings and worn floors, is to hear echoes of those footsteps. To walk the streets once filled with pushcarts and cries of vendors is to glimpse the courage of those who came with little but dreams. The immigrant's journey was not gilded in gold, but in endurance, sacrifice, and hope, qualities that shine more deeply than any surface glitter. Part 13. A Woman's Place. In the Gilded Age, a woman's life was often defined less by what she could do than by what she was expected not to do. The age was full of invention, ambition, and wealth, but when it came to gender, tradition still cast a long shadow. To understand the period fully, one must step into parlors, kitchens, factories, and meeting halls to see how women lived, worked, and fought for recognition in a society that both relied on them and restrained them. Among the wealthy, the ideal of womanhood was shaped by luxury and display. In the marble mansions along Fifth Avenue, daughters of elite families wore gowns imported from Paris, their waists cinched tight with corsets, their hair adorned with feathers, pearls, and diamonds. Their public role was to shine, at balls, dinners, and charity events, reflecting their family's fortune. A woman of society was expected to manage the household with grace, oversee servants, and raise children while also being a living ornament of wealth. She might host salons, organize charity events, or travel abroad, but her influence was confined largely to the domestic and the social. Marriage was the central expectation. For wealthy families, it was not merely a union of hearts but often a union of fortunes. Matches were carefully arranged, balancing money, social standing, and prestige. A wedding could unite railroads with banks, steel with shipping. Women were the bearers of these alliances, their futures charted more by family strategy than personal desire. A successful woman was judged by her husband's power and her ability to maintain a glittering household. For women of the working and immigrant classes, the story was entirely different. Their lives unfolded not in gilded parlors but in tenements, factories, and crowded kitchens. Many began work as children, sewing garments in sweatshop, rolling cigars, or tending machines in textile mills. Their days stretched long, their wages short. Even married women often continued to labor, taking in laundry, mending clothes, or selling food from their homes to make ends meet. For them, marriage did not remove the burden of work, it doubled it, combining wage labor with endless housework and childcare. The conditions were harsh. In garment factories, women bent over sewing machines in rooms where air barely moved, the hum of needles never stopping. Pay was calculated by the piece, forcing speed over safety. Fingers bled, eyes strained, spines ached. In textile mills, lint filled the air, coating lungs with dust. In canneries and food factories, long hours on cold floors left hands swollen and raw. Work offered survival, but at a cost carried in the body. And yet, even in these conditions, women created communities. In tenement kitchens, mothers shared recipes from the old country, stretching scraps into meals. They traded child care, supported one another during illness, and found moments of laughter amid hardship. On factory floors, friendships formed, songs rose above the machines, and quiet solidarity grew. From these bonds came strength, the beginnings of organization and protest. The Gilded Age also saw the growth of the women's suffrage movement, though victory was still far away. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been fighting since the mid-19th century, continued to campaign tirelessly. They traveled town to town, delivering speeches that argued women were citizens and deserved the vote. Crowds often heckled them, newspapers mocked them, and politicians dismissed them. Yet their persistence kept the flame alive, ensuring that the question of women's rights never entirely faded from public view. New generations joined the cause. Frances Willard led the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which at first sought to limit alcohol but soon expanded into broader reform, connecting temperance with suffrage, labor rights, and education. Willard argued that women, as moral guardians of the home, had a duty to shape society beyond it. Her words resonated with thousands, and the WCTU grew into one of the largest women's organizations of the age. Education also opened slowly to women. Colleges such as Vassar, Wellesley, and Smith welcomed female students, offering opportunities once reserved for men. Women studied literature, science, and philosophy, proving that intellect was not bound by gender. Yet barriers remained. Professional careers in law, medicine, or politics were nearly closed, and even educated women often found themselves funneled into teaching, nursing, or women's fields. The glass ceiling of the Gilded Age was heavy, if not always acknowledged. Even leisure carried restrictions. In public parks, respectable women walked under chaperoned eyes. In theaters and dance halls, they risked whispers if they appeared without proper company. Clothing itself reinforced limitations. Corsets tightened waists, long skirts restricted movement, layers of fabric weighed heavily. Reformers like Amelia Bloomer proposed alternatives, but ridicule kept most women in restrictive dress. Fashion reflected not only taste but constraint, a visible reminder of society's expectations. Still, women found ways to challenge limits. Journalists like Nellie Bly went undercover, exposing corruption in factories, asylums, and prisons. Her daring investigations proved that women could be as bold and capable as any male reporter. In activism, reform, and literature, women's voices rose, demanding attention. The seeds of change were sown in the Gilded Age, even if the harvest would not come until the decades that followed. Inside homes, too, change stirred. The idea of the new woman began to appear in magazines and novels. A woman educated, independent, active in society. She bicycled through city streets, she spoke in public forums, she pursued work beyond the home. For some, she was a symbol of progress, for others, a threat to tradition. But whether admired or feared, she showed that the boundaries of womanhood were beginning to shift. The immigrant woman's experience added another layer. She balanced old customs with new realities, speaking her native language at home while her children learned English in school. She carried traditions in recipes, festivals, and prayers, even as she adjusted to life in crowded American cities. Often, she worked outside the home as well, her wages crucial to survival. Her resilience kept families afloat, her sacrifices paving the way for her children's advancement. To picture a woman of the Gilded Age is to imagine many lives at once: a wealthy hostess arranging flowers in a marble hall, a factory girl hunched over a sewing machine, a suffragist raising her voice in a lecture hall, a mother bathing her children in a tin tub in a tenement kitchen. Each image is true, each one part of the larger whole. The place of women in the Gilded Age was both limited and essential. They were denied the vote, yet they shaped households, communities, and movements. They endured long hours of labor, yet they built resilience and solidarity. They were expected to remain silent, yet their voices rang out in reform, journalism, and protest. The glitter of the Gilded Age may have belonged to tycoons and politicians, but beneath it, women carried lives of endurance, ambition, and quiet strength. And so, the Gilded Age's story of women is not one of triumph alone, nor of defeat. It is a story of patience and persistence, of burdens carried and boundaries tested. It is a story of a place still constrained but already shifting, of a society that had not yet granted equality but could no longer ignore the question. A woman's place in the Gilded Age was everywhere, in parlors and tenements, in classrooms and picket lines, in silence and in protest. It was a place both defined by tradition and reshaped by courage, a foundation upon which the future would rise. Part 14. The Country Beyond the City. When people imagine the Gilded Age, they often picture crowded city streets, marble mansions, or smoky factory skylines. Yet most Americans in these decades still lived beyond the city, on farms and in small towns scattered across the vast countryside. Their world was quieter but no less important, shaped by the rhythms of the soil, the cycles of the seasons, and the forces of markets that stretched far beyond the farm gate. To understand the Gilded Age fully, one must walk the dusty roads of the rural Midwest, feel the biting winds of the Great Plains, and hear the creak of wagons rolling through a frontier that was slowly closing. The life of a farmer was never easy, but in these years it grew harder still. For generations, families had relied on local markets, selling crops within a day's ride. Now, with the expansion of the railroads, their produce traveled hundreds of miles: wheat from Kansas to Chicago, corn from Iowa to New York, cotton from Texas to Liverpool. This opened opportunities, but it also tethered farmers to distant prices they could not control. A poor harvest overseas might raise the value of their grain, while a bumper crop elsewhere could ruin their income overnight. Debt became a constant companion. To buy seed, tools, or new machines like steel plows and reapers, many farmers borrowed from banks or local merchants. Railroads charged steep rates to ship goods, often higher for small farms than for large businesses. When prices for crops fell, as they often did in the 1880s and 1890s, farmers found themselves trapped, paying back loans with money they did not have. A harvest might fill barns, yet bring only pennies once sold. The sight of wagons groaning with grain could mean prosperity or despair, depending entirely on the market's whim. The Great Plains, newly opened to settlers after the Civil War, brought both hope and hardship. Families built sod houses where wood was scarce, their walls carved from the earth itself. Winds howled across the flatland, winters froze water in wells, and summers baked fields until they cracked. Grasshoppers swarmed in clouds, devouring crops in a single day. Droughts stretched on for seasons, leaving families staring at barren soil. For every story of a successful homestead, there were many of families who abandoned their claims, worn down by endless struggle. Yet communities formed even in these harsh places. Towns grew around rail depots, their main streets lined with general stores, blacksmith shops, and churches. Farmers gathered for social events like barn raisings, quilting bees, or county fairs, where ribbons were awarded for the finest livestock or the best preserves. These gatherings offered more than entertainment. They gave relief from isolation, a chance to share stories, laugh, and remind one another that they were not alone in their struggles. In the South, farmers faced particular challenges. The Civil War had ended slavery, but the system of sharecropping bound many poor farmers, both black and white, to cycles of debt and dependency. Landowners provided seed, tools, and land, while sharecroppers gave back a portion of their harvest. On paper, it seemed fair. In reality, high interest rates, dishonest bookkeeping, and low crop prices kept families trapped year after year. For African Americans, freedom too often meant replacing chains with contracts that bound them to poverty. Still, resilience endured. Black farmers formed communities, churches, and schools, carving out spaces of independence in the face of discrimination. They joined groups like the Colored Farmers Alliance, which sought fair prices and political representation. Though limited in power, these organizations reflected determination, the insistence that dignity could not be erased, even in hardship. The plight of farmers across the nation gave rise to movements for reform. The Grange, founded in the 1860s, became a social and political organization, pressing for railroad regulation and cooperative buying. In the 1880s and 1890s, the farmers' alliances grew stronger, organizing meetings, publishing newspapers, and calling for changes that would protect rural families from the power of banks and railroads. Out of these efforts emerged the Populist Party, which demanded silver coinage to ease debts, government ownership of railroads, and political reforms that gave ordinary people a stronger voice. The populists never fully triumphed, but their ideas shaped American politics for decades. They spoke to the frustrations of those who felt left behind by the glittering age. Men and women who plowed fields, harvested grain, and raised livestock, yet watched their labor bring little reward. Their speeches, held in dusty town squares beneath the glow of kerosene lamps, echoed with both anger and hope, calling for fairness in a system that seemed stacked against them. Beyond the farms, the frontier itself was drawing to a close. The 1890 census declared the frontier closed, noting that settlement had spread so widely that a continuous line of wilderness no longer existed. The image of the pioneer, wagon rolling westward, axe splitting timber, rifle slung across the shoulder, began to fade into memory. Railroads, telegraphs, and fences had transformed the open land into property lines and towns. The old dream of limitless space was ending, replaced by new questions of how to live within boundaries already filled. Native Americans bore the deepest cost of this closing frontier. Forced onto reservations, their lands taken piece by piece, their cultures attacked by policies of assimilation, they endured loss that cannot be measured in statistics alone. Boarding schools sought to erase languages and traditions, while the reservation system eroded self-sufficiency. For them, the Gilded Age was not gilded at all, but an era of dispossession and survival against overwhelming odds. Despite hardship, rural America held beauty and strength. Sunrise over endless fields painted the land in gold and crimson. The scent of freshly cut hay drifted through barns. Families gathered around tables heavy with cornbread, beans, and pie, their prayers rising into quiet kitchens. Children chased fireflies in the twilight, their laughter carrying across fields. Life was not easy, but it carried its own rhythm, one tied to the land and seasons rather than the ticking of factory clocks. To picture the countryside of the Gilded Age is to see contrasts just as vivid as in the city. Barns weathered but standing strong, fields rich one year and barren the next, communities both isolated and tightly bound. It was a world where struggle and endurance shaped daily life, where neighbors leaned on one another, and where the dream of independence lived on even in the face of hardship. The Gilded Age belonged not only to the mansions of Fifth Avenue or the factories of Pittsburgh, but also to the farmers who bent over plows, the families who braved prairie winds, and the communities that fought to hold their place in a nation rushing toward modernity. Their story is quieter, less glittering, but no less vital. It is the story of soil and sweat, of determination etched into furrows and fences, of resilience that stretched across endless fields. Part 15. The Age That Made Modern America. The Gilded Age has often been described as a paradox. It was an age of glittering wealth and harsh poverty, dazzling invention and exhausting labor, democratic ideals and political corruption. To walk its streets was to see these contrasts side by side, a mansion glowing with chandeliers beside a tenement crowded with families, a newspaper celebrating progress while another reported strikes and riots, a nation proclaiming opportunity even as prejudice and exclusion closed doors. Yet it was precisely within these contradictions that modern America took shape. By the turn of the 20th century, the outlines of the future were visible everywhere. Skyscrapers rose above city streets, their steel skeletons piercing the sky. Electric lights glowed steadily in shops, theaters, and homes, banishing the dark that had ruled for centuries. Railroads tied the continent together with ribbons of steel, carrying wheat from Kansas to New York, cotton from Texas to Europe, immigrants from Ellis Island to the plains. Telegraphs and telephones shrank distance, allowing words to cross miles in seconds. The pace of life quickened, and the very idea of what was possible expanded. But progress was uneven. its price paid by many who did not share in its rewards. Factory workers labored long hours for pennies, their hands blistered and their lungs filled with dust. Children worked in mills and mines, their laughter mixed with the hum of machines. Farmers faced debt and drought, their livelihoods subject to the whims of markets and railroads. Immigrants struggled to find footing, carrying hope in their hearts and hardship on their backs. African Americans endured the legacy of slavery in new forms of segregation and exclusion. Women fought against boundaries that confined them to narrow roles. The Gilded Age revealed the nation's energy but also its inequities, its vitality but also its wounds. Reformers refused to let these injustices remain hidden. Jacob Riis carried his camera into dark tenements. Jane Addams opened her settlement house in Chicago. Frances Willard rallied women to temperance and suffrage. Mother Jones marched with minors and children. Preachers of the social gospel insisted that morality required more than sermons, it required action. Farmers joined alliances, workers formed unions, suffragists raised banners, writers wielded pens that cut through pretense. Their efforts did not overturn inequality in their time, but they planted seeds that would grow into the progressive era and beyond. The political machine showed the corruption of democracy, yet it also revealed the importance of organization in sprawling cities. Strikes and struggles showed the desperation of workers, but also the possibility of solidarity. The great fortunes of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Morgan demonstrated both the heights of ambition and the dangers of unchecked power. Each success and each failure, each injustice and each reform, became part of the larger tapestry of a nation defining itself. The Gilded Age was not only about what happened then, it was about what it set in motion. Labor laws, antitrust regulation, women's suffrage, child protection movements, all trace their roots to this time. The skyscrapers and subways of the 20th century were built on the foundations laid here. The struggles for civil rights, economic justice, and equality carried forward lessons learned in the crowded streets and smoky factories of these decades. To reflect on the Gilded Age is to stand at a crossroads. Behind it lay a rural, agrarian nation of farmers and small towns. Ahead lay an industrial, urban nation of steel, electricity, and vast cities. The transition was not smooth. It was filled with conflict, loss, and dislocation. Yet it was also filled with resilience, creativity, and determination. The America that emerged from the Gilded Age was stronger, though scarred, more modern, though still imperfect, more confident, though not yet complete. In the end, perhaps the most enduring truth of the Gilded Age is that it revealed the character of a nation in motion. It showed the brilliance of human invention, the hunger for wealth, the resilience of ordinary people, the persistence of reformers, and the contradictions of democracy. It was an age gilded in gold, but within that shine lay shadows that demanded recognition. If one closes their eyes and listens to the echoes of that time, the sounds return, the clatter of streetcars, the whistle of trains, the laughter of vaudeville halls, the roar of factories, the cries of newsboys. But beneath them is something quieter, the steady rhythm of endurance. Families rising each day to work, to hope, to fight for a better life. Reformers lifting their voices in crowded halls. Immigrants carrying traditions across oceans and planting them in new soil. These rhythms, more than the glitter or the corruption, formed the heartbeat of the Gilded Age. And so, the Gilded Age deserves remembrance not only for its fortunes and inventions but for its people. The wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the voiceless, the dreamers and the laborious. Together, in conflict and in cooperation, they made an America that was no longer a young republic but a modern nation. The marble mansions may still stand, the photographs of Riis may still shock, the words of Twain may still sting with satire. Yet beyond them, In the countless stories of ordinary lives lived with courage, lies the true legacy of the Gilded Age. It was the age that made modern America, forged not only in steel and gold but in struggle, persistence, and the hope that the future could always be better than the present.